Thank you for tuning in to the newest episode of the Plain Bible Teaching Podcast. I'm your host, Andy Soker. This episode is being released on March 23rd, 2023. And this week I'm joined by Kristofer Gardana, and we're talking about preachers and how often they preach. This was prompted by an article suggesting that pastors should preach no more than 40 weeks a year. As we consider this in terms of a located preacher working with a congregation, we may not agree with the number of weeks that are mentioned in the article, but there are advantages to having others involved in the work of preaching. It's also important to remember that there are other things that a preacher does besides preach on Sundays. So we're going to discuss all of that in our episode this week. For links to the story we're talking about, as well as other related materials, check out the show notes for this episode at plainbibleteaching.com/podcast/032323. Now for our story this week. Why pastors shouldn't preach more than 40 weekends a year. From Vanderbloemen. If you're a lead pastor, chances are you want the quality of your church's teaching to be as excellent as possible. Likely you are the senior pastor because you have a strong teaching gift or the strongest teaching gift on your teaching team. However, I believe that if you are preaching more than 40 times a year, your effectiveness may become hindered. I was a lead pastor for 15 years, and I found that if I taught more than 35 to 40 weekends a year, many things began to suffer. Depending on your other responsibilities and the giftedness of those who step in to teach for you, perhaps you can lower it even to 30 times a year. It isn't a hard and fast rule, but I recommend preaching no more than 40 weekends a year. Here are some reasons you should limit your Sunday preaching. And then in the article, he went to give these reasons. Number one, you need regular breaks. Number two, your people need breaks from you. Number three, your people need to learn from others. Number four, you need to develop other communicators. Number five, there are other areas of church that need your leadership. And number six, it will give you more time to develop as a great preacher. So that's what we're going to talk about here today. I saw this article or came across it a little while back, and I thought it was interesting, kind of saved it and thought it'd be interesting for us to talk about. But I've got Kristofer Gardana here with me again today. Kristofer, welcome back to the show. It's been a little while since, or it feels like it's been a while since we've been able to talk to each other.
Yeah, it's good to be here. And, you being a preacher and me being a preacher, this is like right up our alley. So this is something that we can definitely delve into this time.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this discussion. Now, I do want to, as we start, make a disclaimer here where the article focused on the work of what the author called a lead pastor or a senior pastor. And in a previous episode, we talked a little bit about how we would make a distinction between what the New Testament describes as a gospel preacher, even a located preacher, and what the religious world describes as a so-called pastor, which is what this article was about. But what this article was focusing on was the overlap between the Bible definition of a preacher and the denominational concept of a pastor, which is preaching before a congregation on Sundays. So I think that we can talk about some things here that are going to be relevant to you and me and of others of our brethren who are in the same position that we are. So I want to start off by asking this question. Is there any validity or any good points here about not preaching 40 weeks a year? Maybe not use that number, but are any of his points worth considering? What thoughts do you have on that?
Well, you did point out there that his idea of the preacher / pastor, which, an elder is going to have an oversight role over the flock. I can see how as an elder who are to be apt to teach, if they were focusing specifically on just preaching a lesson every Sunday, maybe two sermons, that, maybe they are going to be overlooking other responsibilities they have. But even as just an evangelist, that's not a quote pastor, obviously, again, going into other episode, but I can understand where he's coming from, because even as an evangelist, there are things that we should be keeping our eyes open for. And if all we're focused on is getting two sermons ready or two lessons each week, and we're not doing anything else, I think we are kind of missing part of what it means to be an evangelist and a teacher. But I understand where he's coming from. One of the things in that list was developing other communicators, and I think that kind of was probably the most important one as far as I'm concerned. In Second Timothy chapter 2, Paul said in verse 1 and 2, "You then, my child, be strengthened by the grace that is in Christ Jesus, and what you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to faithful men who will be able to teach others also." So even Paul talking to Timothy, part of his responsibility as an evangelist was to entrust the word to other faithful men who would be able to teach others also. So your goal isn't just you being the guy that's teaching, but hopefully helping others develop themselves so that they can then teach others.
Mhm. Yeah, that was one of the things that I thought of when we think about this idea of what a preacher's job is. Now, you mentioned the what the New Testament would talk about a pastor really is an elder role, and so there's other considerations there too. But when we think about what a preacher's work is, you mentioned that passage in 2 Timothy 2 and verse 2, and I think you can add to that also Ephesians 4, where you have evangelists mentioned there, and one of their responsibilities, part of their work, is to help equip the saints for the work of service. Now,
We touched on
that's
that
not
last
all.
week.
What's
Yeah.
that?
I said we touched on that last week, or
Right. Yeah.
last time we got
Now,
together.
obviously, that's not always going to be equipping them to be able to preach also as we are preaching, but there may be some, like that passage in 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 2 talks about, that you entrust these things to faithful men who will be able to teach others also, that there is an expectation. Now, this isn't going to be the case in every place, but there should be an expectation that there are others who can step in and teach, that it shouldn't have to be that the preacher is the one who's preaching every Sunday. Now, sometimes that's just the way there's no one else who is able to do that. So in those situations, obviously it's going to be different. But if there are others who can do this, then I do believe it's good to have others be working and developing into that role so that they can also do this, because there may be times when the preacher's sick or the preacher's out of town or other things that happen. The work needs to be able to continue without the preacher. So I think there is some good points in this. We might not necessarily say, well, 40 weeks is what we need to cap this at, but I think there are some valid points here that are introduced in that article. Now, one of the things that I thought of on that, and maybe this is why he used this in the article, was that 40 weeks is really what caught my attention. That I think most preachers, and when I say this, about the 40 weeks, I'm mostly talking about those who are what we refer to as full-time preachers, where they're not, working a secular job or doing things like that. That most preachers who aren't in that position where they're having to work besides preaching in order to support their family, the idea of preaching only 40 weeks out of the year is something that we would kind of ridicule against, or
Yeah, that's like
ridicule about.
12 weeks, right? 12 weeks that you're not.
Right. Yeah, there's
So
whole 12
basically,
weeks, 3
one
months.
week out of each month, you're saying, not at
Right.
all. Yeah.
Yeah. Which is, when you really think about that, that's a lot of time that you're not in the pulpit
Hmm.
preaching. And so I think for a lot of us, we would immediately kind of push back on that and say, well, no, that's way too few times to be in the pulpit. But at the same time, I also think we need to be careful that we guard against the danger of overworking and becoming burned out,
Hmm.
because I think that is a danger. Because I think all of us, you and me and the people that we know who are diligent and trying to do whatever we can, whether full-time preachers or working secular work in addition to preaching, we're trying to do whatever we can, and we're trying to be diligent in that. So there is a danger potentially that we could cross into this part where we are working too much, or we're doing more than really what is sustainable. And the passage that I thought of on this point is in Mark 6 and verse 31, where Jesus reminded his disciples that there were times that they needed to stop and take a rest, that you cannot just work all of the time. See, it says in that verse in Mark 6:31, he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a secluded place and rest a while. For there were many people coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat." So you see this picture that the people are coming, they're listening, they're being healed, and all these things are happening. And Jesus could have easily, or his disciples could have easily stayed busy and continued to do more and more, but he recognized that they were going to get burned out if they continued on at that pace. There has to be a time for rest, and there has to be a time where there is an ability to step back and not continue going 100% or 110% all the time. So while we would, I think, maybe naturally push back on the 40 weeks part of this, I do think it's good for us to kind of make sure that we're not just burning ourselves out and getting to a point where we just decide we can't do it anymore, or we just are just mentally and emotionally and spiritually exhausted through or because of all of it.
Right. I think there needs to be a proper work, balance with family life and all the different responsibilities we have as just individuals, as just individual Christians, whether it be taking care of our family, responsibilities in the home, leadership in the home, all those kinds of things. Especially if you have a family. I'm assuming, my situation where I've got a wife and I've got 4 kids, you've got 5, and it's just there's a lot of responsibilities that go on during the week. I feel like though they would have probably looked at Saturday as their Sabbath as far as their rest day of rest, in the Old Testament and even New Testament times, and so I think there might be some eye roll of some preachers as, oh, well, oh, he can't get up on Sunday and, preach 2 sermons. Oh, poor man, poor man. There's, again, as we're going to get into, there are other things that they need to be doing too, so, but, some of the other things that were in that article, getting input from others. I know that there's been some lessons where when somebody gets up to preach it, my mind's automatically going down well-traveled paths as far as where I think the line of thinking needs to go and the progression of the lesson. And sometimes they take a turn I wasn't ready for, not because it was wrong, but I had never thought of it that way. And so everything I had maybe already understood was still true, hopefully, right?
Right.
but also maybe there's some things that I didn't have right, maybe, and maybe I'd never preached it, but maybe I had certain thoughts, and then they brought out some ideas that I'd never even thought of, where if I'd been the only guy and they said, "Hey, Kristofer, I want you to preach on this subject," I'm going to like, okay, point 1, point 2, point 3, point 4, conclusion, and they had 3 other points that I had never considered. It didn't even cross my mind. And so there are some reasons why it's good to be in the audience listening and being able to absorb information. And maybe it needs to be every month on a Sunday afternoon, or maybe the Sunday morning. Maybe it doesn't necessarily need to be both lessons, or, but if there's a good brother that wants to bring a lesson, maybe it's a subject he's been thinking about or studying. Yeah, I mean, I'm going to learn something.
Yeah. And that's something that I didn't realize as well. I mean, I probably would have said that I understood it, but I didn't understand it as well when I was younger, that there are things that, and it's not like you said, it's not that, well, I'm wrong on a point and this other person's having to correct me. It's that other people make connections from this passage that I never noticed before, or they make a point, and even it's not just necessarily that I'm learning something, but others might learn something better from this other brother over here who's teaching. It doesn't mean that, I don't know if there's a little bit of insecurity there that maybe we sometimes have, that, well, if someone else gets up to preach, then they might decide they like him better, and I don't want to lose my spot as being able to preach. That I don't know if there's some insecurity there that prevents that, but
it could be.
It could be. We don't want to examine anyone's motives except our own, but maybe there is a insecurity there that we don't want to feel like others are in a better position. It's not that necessarily that they are, but we all have different perspectives about things, and we have learned things and made connections in the scriptures, and sometimes the way that we explain something is going to be different from the way that someone else explains something. And the person in the audience there, they may resonate with the way that I explain something, and then the other person may resonate better with the way you explain something, or some other brother who stands up there to teach. So there is a benefit for, as you said, that we can learn something, but also that other people might click better for them
Sure,
if
it's
they
good
hear
for
something
everybody. I
else.
think it's good for everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, where you
One
have different
caveat though,
perspectives like that.
yeah, one caveat though, I was thinking though, in my experience, and this is just again past history of remembering things, when we would try to promote maybe a younger individual to get up and give a talk, and you can tell they're nervous, maybe they've prepared their notes and they're just reading, verbatim everything that they've written down, and it looks like they're reading it off the page because that's what they're doing, because they're too nervous to have either memorized it or to say anything off the cuff. uh, I've seen examples of sometimes it's the older brethren, some different ones. They would get really annoyed because they were like, I came to worship this week, and I had to listen to this person that didn't know what they were doing, and they just get irritated. And then there's the other end of it that they think, well, what are we paying the preacher for if he's not in the pulpit this week? So there are a lot of nuances there that you could go down a rabbit trail following. But again, it goes back to what are the expectations of the preacher? What are the expectations of the congregation concerning the preacher and his preaching? And then also the need, and do they recognize the need to develop new talent that they're going to need to grow, and there are going to be growing pains. There's going to be rough edges. There are going to be misspeaks. There have been many times where I'd hear a young man preach a lesson, and he would make the right point with the wrong scripture, and the scripture he used was not the one. In fact, he's going to get tore apart by someone who opposes that thought, because they're going to say, aha, you didn't, that wasn't the verse. And going to them after worship and saying, hey, I really appreciate your lesson, but did you notice that this is not really what that's talking about? If you're going to make that point, this is the verse you should be looking at. And there are all kinds of things, but then people get annoyed with that. So there's just all kinds of things. So I believe everybody needs to be on the same page, what the preacher's jobs, what his role is, and then also the need to develop new speakers and communicators, and to that they can be faithful, who will then teach others also, and be able to maybe even preach some.
Right. Yeah, and another factor to this, besides just, as you mentioned, a member of the congregation saying, well, I came to hear the preacher, and well, this is what we pay him for. But there's also the part of this where you could have visitors there who this is the first time they've ever come into the doors of the church building, and if the one that they hear, for the young man, or maybe even he's an older man, or whoever it might be,
Whoever, yeah.
that he's inexperienced, and is doing the best he can, but really is not able to communicate it very well, it's very easy for that to be a missed opportunity to teach that one who's there, who's never heard the truth before. So I do think that we need to be making opportunities for other people to stand, other men of the congregation to stand in the pulpit to deliver lessons. But maybe preaching on Sunday morning isn't the time for the first time this young man gets up to speak.
And that's just good experience and good.
Right. Yeah. So there needs to be a process of helping to develop him so he's more comfortable, whether that's training classes or having him do a Wednesday night invitation or whatever it might be, where there's a process that he gets more comfortable with speaking. He's better able to communicate what he's saying and explain the scriptures. So then, he's able to do that. I think that's all part of the training and the development of this that needs to be there, because you have an opportunity to teach the truth to the people who are there, Christians and potentially non-Christians. So you don't want to squander that, but you do want to develop others and not think that, or not have that mindset that, well, only those who are properly trained, or the ones who are professionals at this, they are the ones to do this. We don't want to say that, but we do want to train, and we do want to develop those ones who are capable or potentially capable of this, but do in a way that is beneficial for the congregation, for those who are outside of the church who may be coming in, and all of that, so that everyone can benefit. The one who's learning to speak, that he can benefit from this, that it ends up being good for everyone, rather than as you said, something that people just get frustrated or annoyed about. Is we don't want that. There are going to be growing pains, but we do want to do this in the best way possible
Right.
that benefits everyone.
It just requires good communication with everyone so that no one has unrealistic expectations for any of it, you know.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That everyone has to be on the same page and know what's expected. And then I think once that happens, then you can have this work being done where people are being developed to be
Sure.
able to teach others. Now, as we move on and think about this article, where one of the things that it mentioned, and again, the article was focused on those who are so-called pastors,
Right.
which, what he was thinking as far as what the responsibilities were besides preaching on Sunday morning or whatever, whenever it might be. He was thinking about other types of responsibilities than what we would be thinking of. But there are other things that a preacher is going to be doing besides just standing before a congregation and preaching on Sunday morning. So what is it that preachers are doing besides that? What other work, if they were only preaching 40 weeks a year, and neither of us are advocating that, but
Right.
if they were only doing that, what other types of things are they doing?
Well, I was just thinking about, as we kind of mentioned at the beginning, depending on their financial considerations, they may be working a secular job like I'm doing. But, even when you're doing that, you're looking for opportunities to have conversations, possibly working towards having deeper discussions, possible Bible studies. A lot of people that I work with, they're calling me up on the phone to find an address because I work at FedEx, and but sometimes when I'm done with the conversation, they're not, because they just want to talk, and so I'm like really focused, driven. I want to get done. I'm ready to go home, whatever I need to do, and they'll just sit there and chew the cud for 20 minutes on the phone, and you'd be surprised some of the things that come up in conversation where you can have a deeper conversation when you weren't expecting to necessarily. So I think those are opportunities. Maybe setting up Bible studies, but then also members. When just because you have a regular, maybe a secular job during the week, doesn't mean you can't be using lunch breaks or even just moments where you've got a free minute to call someone that you didn't see on Sunday or Wednesday, or to find out how they're doing, or follow up on someone who was sick. There are all kinds of things, and these are things as a Christian. As I'm pointing out here, this is not really the work of, quote, a preacher. Now, it would be more in the capacity of an elder that has oversight to shepherd the flock and to be looking in those ways. But as individual Christians, those are all things we could be doing as well. Also, as I mentioned before, just because I'm a preacher doesn't mean I'm also not a husband and a father and a brother, and I've got responsibilities at home. So those are all going to be things that I need to do. But when we think about these other things, I do think there is a legitimate grievance with some who say that there are some who are just pulpit preachers, meaning that that's all they plan to do. I've heard this from older preachers, that they tried to teach the younger men to preach, and they think that all it means to be a preacher is to get up on Sunday for 30 minutes or an hour, whatever, twice, and that's it, and they do little else. What should a good evangelist be working toward? What do you think?
Yeah, well, I understand where you're coming from there, because I've been in the same situation where um, we're working full time and then also preaching. There's not a lot of time for other things. But
Mhm.
when you think of those who don't have that burden on them, where they're working full time or and have that where they're having to just do the best they can with that. When you have the ones who are preaching what we call full time, and I've never really liked that term of full time preaching, but because I was thinking, if you're a
Just
preacher,
trying
you
to
preach.
distinguish the difference.
Right.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. So we're using it accommodatively a little bit, but when you think about the someone who's preaching full time, it's not just even though people make jokes sometimes where he only works on Sunday or only works 1 or 2 hours a week, or whatever it might be. There may be some who that's all they do, because you can kind of, if you're lazy and you want to get away with it, and you can probably find churches that will let you get away with that. But there are so many other things that that a preacher can do, the one who's not burdened by secular work, that there's so many other things that he can do where besides preaching on Sunday morning, there's teaching Bible classes, that's something that can be done in the congregation. There can be home Bible studies, there be opportunities of teaching people in the community. Paul, when he was in Athens in Acts chapter 17, he was going into the marketplace and talking with anyone who was present, was invited to the Areopagus and was preaching there. He was using any opportunity that he could to go out and preach others. Another thing that I thought of, and I've always been big on writing, and because I think that's an effective way to help spread the word, especially now that we have the internet.
Yeah, you've been very effective in that way. Even people that don't know you personally, when I mention your name, they'll mention, oh, we use some of his material. And so I've run across a lot of people that have been very thankful for the writing that you do.
Well, for some reason, and I don't know what it was, but back when I decided that I wanted to preach, I had, I just assumed, well, that's just going to be part of the work of preaching is writing. And so that's, I just kind of worked at that, and I'm still not, as good as some other people are at doing that, but I try, that's something that, that I've always tried to do, but that's another way that one who is preaching can use what he's doing, or use the work that he's doing to spread spread the word to others. Things like we're doing here, where we're recording this video, we're releasing it as an audio podcast, and or some people are effective at teaching on social media and things like that. There are all sorts of things that can be done, and kind of what we've talked about already at the beginning, where you're training others to be able to teach that. So there are lots of things that can be done. So if we were to say that, well, we can have others step in and teach, maybe not 12 weeks out of the year, but we can have others step in and preach on Sunday mornings or Sunday evenings or whatever it might be, there's still plenty of work for a preacher to do. That if someone 4 weeks out of the year, 6 weeks out of the year, whatever it is, that they are taking over and preaching on Sunday, there's still lots of things that need to be done, and that
Sure,
can be done.
sure. And whenever someone else is preaching, usually, because I love to lead singing, I usually volunteer and say, hey, this is the one moment I'm not actually preaching today, so I want to lead singing. Back whenever I wanted to start helping work at church and help out and do different things, I actually thought I was only ever going to be a song leader because I just love leading singing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't actually get to lead singing nearly as often as I would like. And so when they get in the pulpit to preach, I think, hey, there's my chance. And so I make sure I get used maybe even more than if I was just preaching that afternoon. Sometimes I want to lead a prayer when they don't normally call on me or whatever, so I don't just sit there in the back and kind of put my feet up and let everyone else do stuff. I actually think that, hey, since I'm not preaching this afternoon, I'm going to go ahead and try to see what else I can pick off and do my own, to help out, because I just enjoy, being useful and, sometimes helping people learn new songs. Even with song leaders, they get in a rut and they pick out the few songs that they always pick. And so when I get in there, I usually try to pick some that we haven't sung in a long time, just so we can learn new songs. So there's a lot of things you can do if you've got the talent and you have the desire, to do different things.
Yeah. There are lots, besides what we talked about with the work of a preacher, but like you mentioned there, where it's leading singing, that's something else that we can step in and do that if someone else is preaching for us. That I didn't think about that, but that's definitely, I like to be able to do that when the few times that I'm not preaching, but don't always get a chance to do that. But anyway, as we wrap this up here, and we think about what the preacher's work is, that what the preacher is to be doing is preaching and teaching the word of God in different ways, in different capacities. And that's going to include more than just preaching on Sundays. It might be teaching Bible classes, it might be having Bible studies, or, Kristofer, you mentioned that even with working secular work, you're still talking to coworkers and having conversations with them. There are lots of things that can be done. And if others can be involved in the work of preaching on Sundays, in addition to what the preacher is doing, then that's great. But when we think about the preacher and his work, he needs to be diligent in his work. And the members of the congregation need to be diligent in their work also. And if either one of those is having to pick up the slack from the other, then it's going to hinder the Lord's work. So all of us need to be working together, all of us contributing so that the Lord's work can be done in the best way possible. So, Kristofer, do you have anything to add before we quit for today?
I would just emphasize that good communication is needed among the whole congregation, including the preacher and everyone else, about the proper expectations of the preacher's work, while also encouraging new talent, using patience with inexperienced speakers, because they may have a wealth of knowledge, but then they have not developed, or they need to continue developing the ability to actually present it in a competent manner. And so it may not be that they're a novice in the Bible, but just the speaking part. And so we've got to have patience as brethren, to encourage them not to extinguish those little sparks of zeal that they have chosen to go before the congregation and to bring a lesson. We need to be encouraging that, and when they do, let them know how grateful we are for their efforts.
Yeah, because we're all on the same team, so everyone can contribute. Everyone needs to be encouraged in their work, and as you said, we all need to be on the same page and communicating. So that's a good point. That's all for this week. Thank you for listening to the Plain Bible Teaching Podcast. I hope you found it to be interesting, informative, and helpful. For links to the story we talked about, as well as other related materials, visit the show notes for this episode at plainbibleteaching.com/podcast/032323. And as a side note, a new book by Kyle Frank, Biographies of Restoration Pioneers, contains some biographical sketches of several 19th century preachers. And related to what we've just talked about here in this episode, it's interesting to read about the preachers of that day and some of the schedules that they kept. Abner Jones at one point was preaching 30 to 40 sermons a month. Raccoon John Smith preached over 500 sermons in 1 year. Now, obviously, they're different times from then to today, but it's interesting to read about the work that was done by men like that. And if you want to read more about them and the others that are in that book, I'll include a link to that in the show notes if you want to check that out. But if you have a moment to rate and review the podcast or share it with others that you think would be interested, that is always appreciated. And if you're listening to this, remember that we are uploading video versions to the Plain Bible Teaching YouTube channel. So if you prefer the video to the audio, then that option is available to you. And if you're watching this on YouTube, please like this video and subscribe to the channel so you can see other videos that we post here from time to time. And if you see a news story that you think would make for a good discussion, or some topic that you think would be good for us to cover here, please email that to me at andy@plainbibleteaching.com. Thanks again for listening, and I hope to talk to you again next week.